So this is the third and final part of this portrait painting lesson. All the preliminary parts are in the first two parts of this video, which I'll link down below in the description. So let's get right into the painting from where we left off last time. So the first thing I'm doing here underneath the eye is adding in some of these wrinkles and creases on the blank canvas. Just like in the second part of this video, to control the values, I'm trying to pull back a very small amount on the trigger, but I'm also trying to bounce the paint off the shields or the piece of paper. Sometimes it's a lot easier just to add in your textures before you add in any value. So as you can see here, I didn't spray any color over this lower part of the eye. All I did was use my shields and, a piece of paper here and there, a ripped piece of paper, just to add in some of the textures. This way, if they're off, they're very easy to erase because it's just blank canvas under there. You're not going to be removing any, values or layers of paint that were sprayed on previously. So these small thin lines are going to act as shadows for these folds and wrinkles in the skin. And to get them looking more realistic, of course, with every shadow, we're going to need some highlights. So using my same flesh tone here, I'm just going to lightly spray this over the whole area to put some value down. And of course, because this is a transparent color, we're not going to lose those lines underneath this color when we spray it down. And the reason that we're adding some paint onto the surface here is so that we have something to erase into, because we want to pull out some highlights next to these shadows, and the only way to do that is to have some paint down there first. So just spray it nice and light. The less paint you have, the easier it is to erase. If we only paint using the airbrush, you're going to see that we get a very smooth texture like this. Now, it's up to you to decide if you want to keep it smooth right out of the airbrush or if you want to add some more texture to it. If you watched any of my other videos, you'll know that I really like kind of a gritty, more organic looking texture. It just looks more natural to me, but again, that's my preference. Generally, if you want the portrait to look more flattering, let's say it's a commission for someone and they want it to look nice, you don't want to add too much skin texture. You want to keep everything nice and smooth. But on this one, I want this to have much more of a human look rather than that photoshopped airbrush look where everything is too smooth, so we're just adding some textures with the eraser. One of the main reasons that I love using gessoed canvas over an airbrush paper or a synthetic paper is that I can really decide how much paint I want to pull out just by how much pressure I use with my eraser. So here I'm using the Staedtler Mars Razor, and if I press really hard, I'm basically pulling the highlight out to pure white. But if I want it more subtle or more subdued, I don't have to use as much pressure, and you just get so much control over your image of pulling out highlights. But again, if we ever pull out a highlight too bright, it's no big deal because we could just take that same transparent flesh tone and lightly glaze it over the top. So let's switch over to the X-Acto blade and slow this video back down to real time. I'm pulling out some bright eyelashes just underneath this lower eyelid. Now these bright eyelashes were not in the reference photo. I'm just adding them in because it kind of gives a cool look. It makes it look like some light is catching and reflecting off a few of the eyelashes. But if you do this, you want to make sure that you don't overdo it. You just want to add a few. So as you can see, I'm just adding about 3 or 4 on the left side of this lower eyelid, then maybe 1 in the middle. Then I'll switch over to a colored pencil and start adding in some of the darker ones. I think subtlety is very important when you're adding this because it's very easy to get carried away and make really bright highlights or pull out way too much paint. So I think the best way to learn is to look at that reference photo, anything that you work from, look at what you're seeing and try not to overdo it. Sometimes it's way easier to make, extreme textures and really bright highlights than it is to kind of, paint them more mildly and kind of tame everything down. Now, of course, I've sped up this video to keep the time limit down, but I just want to point out that I work on this very slowly. Just this one eye probably took me about 2 hours, and I've probably painted hundreds of eyes by now, and I kind of know what I'm doing while I'm working on them, but still, I don't want to rush. I like to take my time and work slowly. So if you notice that you catch yourself rushing or you're speeding up because you want to get it done, try to exercise some restraint and back off, walk away from it, do something else for a little while and then come back. It's really important not to rush because once you start speeding everything up, that's when you just start making mistake after mistake and you don't really notice the mistakes, and it kind of snowballs and gets worse and worse. So just make sure you take your time. So working our way down to these next few wrinkles, I'm using a ripped piece of paper because I can see in the reference that these have some texture to them, so I don't want them too smooth. Now what I like to do is I like to use the area that I just painted as a reference for the next section that I paint. What I mean by that is that I'm judging the values that I'm laying in right now compared to the areas that we finished before. So if I'm painting in some dark shadows here, I want to get them equally as dark as the shadows up above the eye, in an area that we finished. So not only am I constantly looking at my reference, but I'm also constantly looking at other parts of my painting to try to make everything kind of match and meld together. Now I'm going to add some hatching lines or highlights to this part of the skin here. And what I'm using is a sand eraser that's cut to a very sharp chiseled edge. And I just placed it in a clutch pencil. These are used to hold lead or large pieces of graphite. And if I use this to pull out some highlights, you can see we get a very drawing or draftsman-like look to the texture here. And I think it's nice. It adds something a little bit different than the skin texture circular motions that we get with the eraser or that skin texture template. Now, is a texture like this photorealistic? I wouldn't think so. It looks kind of drawn and kind of etched in, but I think that's kind of what I was talking about in the last part of this video, where you don't want to be a slave to that photograph, and you don't want to try to be that human copy machine where you're trying to replicate every single pore. Here we pulled out some highlights in a different way, some hatching, and I think it looks cool, and I think it just adds something different to the image, makes it look a little bit more human than very sterile or machine-like that you get from, like, you know, true photorealistic painting. So going back to the original notion that there's no right way and there's no wrong way to paint, you can do whatever you like to pull out highlights, and make sure you experiment with different techniques, because these little lines that I added in here, I just kind of made up as I was going along with the painting, and I like the effect. You know, I thought it looked interesting, so I kept it. But if I didn't like it, it's no big deal. I could switch over to a regular eraser and then basically just erase it out using small circular motions to add a different texture over it. And then if that's too light, we can darken it up again with paint. So you're never really stuck when you experiment and you paint in this style. If we take a look at these dark shadows, we'll see that the value looks about right. They're dark enough, but the hue is not correct. It looks way too warm. It looks too much of a reddish color. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding some sepia into the airbrush. Compared to red, sepia is a cooler color. It's more toward blue than it is toward red. It's not a bluish color at all. It's much more neutral, but compared to red, it's bluer, so it's going to be a cooler color. So as I spray that over the shadows here, not only am I darkening them, but I'm also knocking down some of that red in there, and that's going to give me a more realistic look, because generally, as you add in a flesh tone, the shadow of that flesh tone is going to shift to a more neutral or cooler version of that original color. So let me show you a before and after here so you could see the difference. When you paint, it's so subtle that you could barely even tell, but you can see here that this one is much more red-orange, and then this version over here is much cooler. The shadows look browner more than they do red or orange. It's very subtle, but there is a difference between the two. And if you really want to make that shadow cooler, I like to use black, but I thin it out a lot with some distilled water, and then do the same thing, just lightly spray it over the shadow. Moving over to the left side of the face, we're going to start by painting in this ear before we get into the actual skin textures. So I'm placing a piece of frisket over the top of this, and then just cutting out the outlines or the contours around it. This way I'm going to prevent overspray from getting on the canvas. A lot of this ear is in the background, and it's kind of out of focus, so we don't have to worry about adding too much detail or a lot of texture to it. We can kind of keep everything subdued so it looks like it's hidden away in the background. So as you can see, I'm using my shield with my normal flesh tone and just lightly spraying in the macro values. So I'm basically squinting my eyes when I'm looking at the reference photo and just spraying in dark values where I see them. Now, as I remove the frisket film, you can see we get nice clean edges around this ear. And even if I stopped right here at this point, this would work just fine for the portrait. Sometimes you don't have to complete every single part of the portrait. As the viewer is looking at it, sometimes they don't even notice areas in the background, and they kind of fill it in themselves, and it looks complete even though it's unfinished. So you don't have to go into crazy detail for every part. If there's something in the background, you don't want to spend another few hours working on it, just try to keep it simple. So that's exactly what I did here. The only thing I'm adding to this now is I'm switching to sepia, and just like before, darkening up those shadow areas, trying to make the color a different temperature than that bright orange flesh tone. Moving further along to the side of the face here, the first thing I want to do is mask off the edges of it. So here I'm using some 3M tape, and this is vinyl tape, so you can get nice curves with it very easily. And I'm just masking off the sides and then laying some painter's tape over the top of it. Now there's a lot of blank space here, so I want to break it up using that skin texture template. And I'm not really thinking about this. I'm just laying it over this blank area on the cheek and then spraying over it. And of course, using the normal flesh tone. And you can see we get these little spots here. At this point, this texture looks very unnatural and it looks kind of strange. That's because the background behind it is still pure white, so there's very high contrast between those texture dots and the white canvas itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to spray over this with our transparent flesh tone, just nice, light, easy. We're not going to spray too much, but as we do that, we're filling in that white canvas, and it's going to start to look more natural and more subdued. As I spray the flesh tone over this area, what I'm doing is mapping out a few of the areas here, basically a few of the shadows where we have some folds of skin, and I'm using the an airbrush shield because I want these lines sharp. I'm not using the ripped piece of paper for this, not yet. As I look at some of the creases and wrinkles toward the top part of the cheek, I notice that these do have some texture to them, so this is a perfect place to switch over to a ripped piece of paper. And you can see we get two contrasting types of lines here. These sharp lines toward the bottom have a very different look from the textured ones toward the top. Since I still have the paint in my airbrush, I'm going to darken a few areas of the cheek here, and of course this color we're going to have to shift later on using some sepia over the top of it. But from here we're going to switch back to the eraser and start pulling out some of the highlights here, and that's going to make these wrinkles look more natural, because if you have a highlight, it's going to look like an area is raised and the shadow is going to look like it's going farther away from us. So it's going to give us a bit of a 3D look to each one of these wrinkles. And there's a lot of texture on this skin, so I'm constantly looking back at my reference and then using different techniques. I'm erasing with that hatching motion, which are basically parallel lines erased out next to each other, and then of course using small circular motions with the eraser, and that's going to give a more organic texture that looks similar to pores to me. And as we start adding these up, you can see that the original texture that we added with the skin texture shield starts to look natural, right? It kind of blends into the rest of the skin itself. So what looked very strange in the beginning starts to look more natural as you paint further on, and that's just all about adding, you know, multiple layers. I want to start darkening up some of these shadows. So what I'm doing is I'm using a mixture of 50% sepia and 50% black. That's going to give us a very dark, cool tone, and we're going to spray this into these areas to make it look like a cast shadow. When you're using a dark color like this, you have to be very careful, because if you spray too much, it's going to look pure black, and that's not going to look natural at all. We want the color to be dark, but we still want to retain some of that original flesh tone that's underneath it. If I want to darken this up later, that's no problem. I could spray the exact same color over it. So I'm going to stop here and move on to the next section, and again, if we need to alter it later on, we will. I noticed that on this part of the lip, it's in a very dark cast shadow, just like that part next to the nose that we just finished. So I'm using the same color as before to spray this in. When you're using color like this, which is 50% black and 50% sepia, you have to be very careful not to get this on other areas of the portrait, because this color is not going to look natural at all if it gets onto some of the lighter parts of the skin tone. You could only get away with using a dark color like this on areas that are in cast shadow, basically like the section we're working on here, or maybe something like the pupils in the center of the eye. Anywhere else, it's not going to look natural at all. The color is going to look very different from the other skin tone that we placed on. So to break up some of that soft look of the airbrush, I'm just switching over to my eraser to pull out some highlights here, just add some texture into it. This is not difficult at all. It's a very simple thing. Just basically just moving it around, pulling out some small subtle highlights. Now let's switch back to our original flesh tone and start working on this nose. Since I paint with my right hand, I generally like to start on any section from the left and then work my way over to the right. That way if I lean my hand on the painting, I'm not gonna, smudge or ruin any of the paint that I just laid down. So the same thing goes for the nose here. I'm working on the left side, adding in some of these values and working my way over. When you're painting a nose, you're almost sculpting it with the paint. So what I mean by that is where we add shadows, those areas are gonna look like they're moving farther away from us. And anywhere we have highlights, they're going to look closer to us. And essentially what we're doing is we're creating an illusion on this flat surface. So in my opinion, adding in these macro values are way more important than adding in the textures, because this is going to really define the whole shape of the nose. When we see it, we're going to notice that those darker areas look like they're moving farther away from us, and the highlights look closer, and it's just giving us that illusion of a nose. But of course, we're trying to take this painting further, so we're going to go past the macro values and start working on the micro values, which are the textures. Now, I could have started with that skin texture template, but I decided here just to start adding in the paint first and then switching over to the eraser to pull out some of the textures. If you look at the eyes, you'll notice that the specular highlights are on the right side, meaning that our light source is over to the right. Now on the nose here, you may be wondering why there's some highlights on the left side of the nose if the light source is over to the right. And that's not because there's a secondary light source here. What that is the light source basically bouncing off things in the room, maybe bouncing off the wall, anything else in the room, and reflecting back onto the nose. So you're always going to get a secondary highlight in some of your shadows. So that's what I did here on the left side of the nose. These highlights, of course, are going to be much duller and much dimmer than any of the primary highlights, and they're going to be much more subdued than any of the specular highlights, which are the highlights in the eyes. So hopefully that's not too confusing. I think the most important thing, again, is always going back to your reference or your subject and looking at it to see where the highlights are, because that's going to tell you if there's a subtle highlight in one section or a brighter highlight in another. And I don't think you really need to worry about what the names of individual highlights are called. It really doesn't matter. That's just a lot of technical data that may make it more confusing than it does helpful. So if you use your reference or your subject as your guide, that's going to tell you where those different shadows and highlights are, and that's really the best way to learn, just learning to improve your skills and observation. And if you're painting along with me, trying to learn on this one, make sure you watch the first part of this video, the very beginning of it, because I put up some stills, some high resolution stills of this final painting, so you can use that as a reference. So at this point we have the nose mapped in, it looks right. Now it's just going further along and adding some details and just adjusting any of the areas that we want to look better. Painting in a nose is really not that difficult. It may be confusing the first or second time you're working on it because you're learning where those basic curves are and shapes, but over time you'll get this down in no time, and you'll start to feel like the nose is one of the easiest parts of the portrait. Because me personally, I usually enjoy the nose and the eyes the most because I've just done so many of them that I kind of know where it's going to go before I actually start painting it. And if you feel like you're having a difficult time with it, that's no big deal. You'll get better with it in time. Just keep working on them. Eventually I'm going to make a video on this, but I think one of the best ways to learn is just by using graphite pencils. It's like a simple version of an airbrush or a simple version of a painting, and you could really learn all those forms, the shadows and everything, just by using a few different pencils and some blending stumps on paper. You don't have to worry about the big cleanup of, airbrush paint and thinners and all that. So if you find yourself struggling on things like the nose or the ears or even the eyes, switch over to drawing for a little bit. Just try to relax with it, have fun with it, and practice just individual parts of the portrait, maybe, a few different noses at different angles, and just see if you can get those values where they need to be just by using graphite. Because once you get that down, you're going to be doing the exact same thing with the airbrush. There's really no difference between the two, and with both you're also pulling out highlights the same way by using an eraser. So let's continue along with the right side of the face here. I'm using a ripped piece of paper just like before to add in some of these shadows, and since the right side of the face here is a large open area, I'm going to switch over to that texture template and lightly spray it over this whole area just like we did on the left side of the face. And so I don't get overspray on the right side of the canvas, I'm just going to mask off the edge of the face here and then do the exact same thing on the right side here that we did on the left side. Now this side is going to be a little bit easier than the other side because there's not that many wrinkles and the light is kind of blurring everything together, so you really can't see that much detail on the right side of the face here. As I'm working on the rest of this side of the face here, I want you to practice your observation skills. Look at the areas where you see shadows and look at areas where you see highlights and think to yourself the best way that you'd go about putting those on your own painting. Just because I paint a certain way doesn't mean it's the correct way. I know I say this in most of my videos, but I think it's true, and I really want to point that out, because learning to paint your own way is really going to make it special to yourself, and it's going to make the whole process so much more fun and enjoyable, and it's not going to be a chore where you're feeling like you have to follow a certain number of rules to get your painting down. And as long as you keep painting, you're going to start inventing your own style and your own techniques that are going to feel natural to you, and it's not going to feel like you have to follow step 1, step 2, where it almost feels like paint by numbers. That to me is just such a boring way to paint or to create art. It should be about finding a way that's comfortable, because we all think differently and we're all going to have a different approach to something, including the way we paint portraits. So as I'm working on this part here, just below the nose, there's a lot of texture going on here, but we can see the right side of this is brighter because that's where the light source is hitting it. And as it fades off to the left, everything starts to get darker. So that's what I say, or that's what I mean when I say macro values, large values. The right side's bright and the left side's dark. And as long as you get those macro values in any of your portraits, the painting's going to look correct. It's going to look like a person. Those are really the areas that you want to focus on before you go in to start adding all the details. Of course, the details are really nice and they add a lot more to the painting and they make it interesting to look at up close, but if you have those major macro values off, all the micro details are going to look wrong anyway. So make sure you focus on the large areas before you really go in and dive in for those micro details. So as we move down to the lower lip, I'm using the exact same techniques by adding in shadows first, and I'm using the same flesh tone as we use for the rest of the portrait. And just like the other parts, shadows go in first for me, and then I spray a slight glaze over the top of it, and then I could erase into it to pull out some highlights. Now we all know the color of lips is a reddish or pinkish tone, so the flesh tone we're using right now is not going to be the correct hue. And when I say hue, I basically mean the color. So what we're going to do is we're going to glaze a very bright red over the top of this. The color is called Scarlet by Createx Illustration Colors, and we're going to glaze that over the top, and it's going to help shift that hue from that skin tone, that orange reddish color, to a brighter red color. So what we're doing here is essentially the same thing we did with those dark cast shadows. Remember when we worked on those, we used the flesh tone to add them in first, and then we used sepia and some black to shift the hue toward a cooler tone. So here we're using the same technique, but this time we're switching to a warmer tone. Now I don't want to get too technical because I feel like there's a lot of information in these videos and I don't want to confuse anyone, but one thing that you have to know is when you spray any color over another color, it's going to darken that value. So when we were painting in those cast shadows, the sepia was helping us not only shift the color to a cooler tone, but it also helped darken the value. Now that we're going to use a glaze to help make a warmer tone on the lips, a more reddish tone, we're going to have to be careful because this color is going to shift the hue, but it's also going to darken it. And if we have the values off, the lips are going to look too dark and they're not going to look right. So my way around this is I just spray the smallest amount of that paint possible. I'll try to keep the lips as light as I can with the detail I need. And then when I spray that transparent scarlet over the top of it, I just spray the smallest amount. And when you look at it, just that little bit of red in there makes the entire lips look red, so it's kind of like an illusion. But the good news is that since we're using airbrush colors and we're spraying such a small amount of paint, if we do go too dark, we could always erase into it, and that'll knock the value back down and also add some more texture. So try to keep it light, but if you go too dark, it's not the end of the world. You can erase into it and clean it back up. Now the chin has a lot of texture to it. There's like whiskers going on and there's a bunch of pores. So I started with that texture template, then sprayed over a light amount of paint, and then used the texture template again on top of that paint. This way I built up 3 thin layers of textures before I switched over to the eraser. Now the eraser I'm using here is a Dremel, which is basically just an electric eraser. Any electric eraser will do. And I'm just tapping in a whole bunch of dots, just going very slowly, trying to tap them randomly all around this small section. Once this is done, of course, we're going to glaze some paint over the top of it, and this way we're going to darken them up slightly. And the whole time here, I'm just using that same transparent flesh tone that we mixed in the first part of this video. Now, I'm well aware that I'm talking pretty quickly in this video and going over a lot of information very fast, but let's simplify a few things here. The majority of this portrait was painted with one color. That was a flesh tone that we mixed in the beginning of the first part of this video. And like I said in that part, we basically mixed a muted dark orange color, and that's going to work for almost any flesh tone. Then from there, all we do is adjust it using sepia and some black for the cooler colors. And then I think the only other time we switched it was for the lips, right, where we sprayed some scarlet on top. So when you use an airbrush with a very limited palette like we're doing here, you simplify so many things. You're not worrying about mixing all these different values for transitions from a highlight to a mid-tone to a shadow. You're just using one color to do that. And what I love about that is it makes you focus your attention on the values. For me, values are 99% of any paintings. It's where the darks are and where the lights are. That's going to give you form, shape, transition. That really defines every single thing of the portrait. The color is nice. It's more of an aesthetic thing on top of it, but the value is the most important part. So let me give you an example here. Let's say you're new to painting and you don't really understand the concept of values, where to put darks and where to put lights in a portrait. If you take a reference photo and then you use any app, Photoshop, whatever you have, and switch it to black and white and then print it out, then only use the color black to paint your whole portrait, thin it down with some water or some reducer, you'll see that while you're painting that portrait, you're doing the exact amount of work that we're doing in this one. There's no difference because you're adding in the values where they need to be, and you're using your erasers and skin texture templates to add in that texture. And in art history, this was called the grisaille. It's basically a black and white painting, basically a study or a preliminary layer for the final painting. And of course, the goal of painting the grisaille was to simplify everything. It was to focus the painter or the student just on painting the values rather than, having to mix all these different colors. So we're actually using color here, but we're really doing the same thing as grisaille. We simplified everything. We're just using one color, and we're adjusting those values with how much paint that we add to the canvas. And then of course, if we need to shift them for the darks or for some of the highlights, we'll do that. So this is going to lead me into sneaking in some art history just for the end of this video, because I think it's really important. Let's take a look at one of my favorite portraits by Ang. Now this painting is here in New York at the Met in the Robert Lehman collection. This portrait was completed in 1853, and this is part of the French neoclassical movement. Personally, I think technique-wise, this is probably the highest of any form of Western painting. So let's take a look at some of the technique here. I don't know if you noticed it, but if you look at the very bottom of this painting, you'll see a slight hint to Ang's painting techniques. So right here underneath this really bright blue color, you can see that he painted the dress originally in a grisaille, in a black and white tone, and they used a glaze of a transparent color over the top of it to shift that hue toward that blue color that we see. Now this is just my guess, but I think he did that to simplify everything, to really focus on those values, the darks and the lights, and once those were all in, he switched over to a transparent blue and glazed that over the top of it. This way he was able to achieve all those important details without having to worry too much about the color. Now I'm not 100% sure about all this. This is just my suspicion, but from what I read, it seems like he used a lot of grisailles in his works. There's also other ones like the Grand Odalisque, but I'm not going to get into that right now. So going back to our very simple painting now in comparison, we can see that if a master like Ang was able to use some techniques to kind of help him out, make things simpler for him, there's nothing wrong with us doing that too. Any way you could simplify a painting is always going to make the process more enjoyable, and it's going to make it easier on yourself. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I hope you enjoyed this 3-part painting video. This was a fun one to do. You know, eventually as I continue making more videos, I'll figure out if I want to make them longer or if I want to make them in multiple parts like I did for this one. You know, we'll see as we add more videos. So again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.